What is up, everyone? Welcome to another new review space. Hopefully everything's working here. Jeff, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, man. Thanks for being here. Welcome.
Yeah, sure.
So sorry that the original space glitched out there. I was trying to avoid using these headphones that I'm on.
Yeah.
Because for some reason, when I use these headphones, they've got a very plasticky sort of casing. So every time I move or it twitches at all, you can hear it through the mic, which pisses me off, especially when I use it for like a podcast or something. So I just don't feel like spending $300 on new headphones.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is my first space. So, like I say, bear with me, guys. I have no idea how this sounds. I decided to use my phone because I figured that would be easier than using my laptop.
You sound great.
So cool.
You sound great. And yeah, thanks for being here. This being your first space, and also again, like we had originally had sort of scheduled this space about a month ago, and we had at that time, Craftbeard and Andres was just new to the community, and he was bringing a really wonderful sort of perspective and bona fides to the conversation, especially the abduction phenomena. So that, and I just double booked you guys. So I just want to apologize, in unaudible form.
Well, thank you. He did a great job. I don't listen to a lot of spaces either. I mean, to be honest, I've only listened to a handful of them over the 2 years I've been on Twitter, but I did listen to that space, and it was an excellent conversation. Honestly, he said it better than I could, so it was a better guest.
Well, I don't know. I wouldn't say better guess, but I felt like at the time, especially what was going on in the Twitter space at that moment, I felt like it was an important discussion to have. But either way, I appreciate your patience and sort of your understanding on that, and I just wanted to start there. But I guess let's dive into this. So you have UFO historian, archivist. You've got 30 plus years studying the phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of the current state of ufology as far as where we're at today and what's been going on here, especially in the last almost decade now?
Personally, I find it a little sad and disappointing, to be honest. I mean, a lot of people talk about all the progress that's been made in the topic in the last few years, and I guess that kind of just depends on what you mean by progress. If you measure progress by laws that some activists have been able to get passed, in the government, then sure, I guess. But have we really learned anything new in the last few years? No. In fact, we've just basically rehashed and repeated many old and debunked cases. And when I say like debunked or hoax cases, I'm not even talking about stuff that's like questionable. Like there's some people on both sides. Like a lot of these cases are pretty definitively like debunked by everyone, even believers. And they're being brought up all over again. So I'm not too excited or impressed with what's happened in recent years. And I also think it's tragic because it's kind of diverted attention away from real serious study of the topic. Most of these people don't even care about the UFO topic really, or the history of it, or what's happened, because they believe the government's going to tell them all the answers. And so why bother reading a book? Why bother studying the history if the government's already got the bodies, they've already got the ships, and we can get that information out of them? The only problem is none of this is new. This goes back to the beginning of the topic. It's always been a couple years away when the government was going to tell us the truth. It doesn't happen. And unless you study the history and you're familiar with what's happened before, you come into this topic and you think this is all amazing and this is all new and this has never happened before. Only, yeah, it kind of has many times, and nothing ever happens from it.
Yeah, I think my biggest argument, at least when I was, pro legislative aspect of it, was the idea that yes, this has happened before, but we've never seen laws written like this to sort of help, at least at the time, what I thought bring the truth forward. Which
Yeah.
in reality, what was going on is that this is a mechanism to ensure that the United States is protecting itself from all foreign adversaries, especially when it comes to drones, adversarial or non-adversarial drones. It's an issue.
Yeah. And there certainly are some differences like that. Like, yeah, there's the first time laws like that have been put in place. But like when you really get down to it and ask like what's changed? Like what do we know? What do we really know now that we didn't know, before 2017? Like, have we really got any new information that's actually changed anything? From my perspective, we haven't. Nothing has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to agree with that, but it's true. I mean, the facts are what the facts are. I thought for sure that 2023 was going to be a very interesting and big year for the discussion based
Yeah.
off of what I was hearing and who I was talking to at the time. And then, of course, 2023 has gone and passed, and it's, obviously nothing has happened. I mean, we've gotten, again, some legislative movement, but when you really dissect all the legislative movement that's happening, it's really to defend ourselves and make sure that we're up to date in the defense of adversarial drone tech. And also, I think it's a combination of our tech as well. I think UFOs have always been a great smokescreen to cover U.S. black tech or hardware. And there's been many examples of that throughout history. And just FYI, for the rest of the audience that's listening, I see some hands that were going up. We'll definitely be opening the second half of this discussion to any questions or anybody that wants to come up here. So just hold tight for about another 45 minutes, and yeah, we'll bring everybody up and we'll have a roundtable with Jeff Knox. But yeah, I mean, what do you think of that?
Yeah, and I'll also say that the thing is, like, with all this recent news, there's very little actual like studying of the UFO topic going on, right? Like the people that actually put the hard work and effort in this topic aren't the people that we promote and give attention to and praise in this community. The
Well,
people
let's
that
take a moment right now. Who do you think should be praised in that regard? Who's your favorite?
uh, there's a lot of very hardworking researchers, and they're not, that well known to the general public. You've got people like Barry Greenwood and Jan Aldrich and Michael Swords and David Marler. He's a bit more well known because of his UFO archives and his Triangulate UFO book. These guys that are out there every day, like actually like in the archives, in the files, preserving them, scanning them, getting them out there for other researchers. The people that are actually doing the work are not really the people that are put forward, because the people that are put forward are, your Lou Elizondos, your Colt Harts, Corbells, Knaps, those guys. And it's these other guys that do this hard work, and researchers around the country, around the world too. A lot of international researchers never really get the proper respect they deserve, because we're kind of US centric here, and we don't pay a whole lot of attention to the other UFO communities out there. Like there's great researchers around the world, Theo, in Belgium, and Eduardo Russo in Italy is one of the top Italian researchers. There's a lot of really great researchers out there. They just don't get the attention they deserve. And a lot of the researchers that, they get attacked. We just recently saw Philip Mantle basically get into it with like Luis Elizondo. And while I actually don't really necessarily agree with Philip Mantle on much, but he is a respected researcher that's been doing this, for decades. And he runs probably the largest UFO book publishing company that's putting out most of the other UFO researchers' books out there. And these guys get attacked on a regular basis when they're the ones actually studying the topic and doing the work.
No, that's great. I'm glad you took the time to point them out. Yeah,
And there's many more.
go
Like
ahead.
if I don't mention them, it's not because they're not doing good work. It's just there's so
Right,
many good
obviously.
researchers. Yeah.
Well, what do you think that is because, uh, with the exception of Philip Mantle, I think everyone else is pretty much not on social media. So do we get this sort of
Yeah.
idea that they're not heavily involved because they're just simply not part of social media? Because I know for sure if you go to UFO cons across the country or the world, I'm sure those names ring bells, and
Yeah.
and there's fans of people out there. But yeah, you're right. Like in these conversations in social media, they're non-existent.
Yeah, and this is something I pointed out before, is that there's really kind of like a distinction between like the UFO Twitter community and the actual like UFO and UFO research community. Like they're actually almost kind of two distinct separate communities. And as you mentioned, a lot of these people, they are older in age. They don't necessarily use social media. They definitely don't use Twitter. If they're on Facebook, it's rare, and most of them don't even use Facebook. And so, like, if you grew up in the '90s watching shows like UFO Files on History Channel, you've probably seen them on shows. But nowadays, nowadays you don't, and because they're not really out on the social media. And a lot of these guys are they're almost more researchers. They're the guys in the background, kind of like me. I've been in this topic a long time, and it's almost always been in the background until the last 2 years when I started to do my post. And so there's researchers that, like, if you're really into UFOs and you spend all your time studying and researching it, that you'll be familiar with them. But if you just get your UFOs from Twitter or your generic UFO documentaries, you'll never hear of these guys. If you don't spend your time reading a lot of UFO books, you'll never hear of these guys. And sadly, a lot of people don't read books these days. I get people on Twitter that say, "What's the point of reading a UFO book when there's Twitter and YouTube and videos?"
Yeah, it's tough to compete. I would let me ask you this, because this has sort of been a big sort of point of debate in a lot of these Twitter spaces, and that is, what is the best piece of evidence that research in the UFO field has provided? What is the most tangible things? And a couple of answers that I've gotten, one in particular, which I was just like, yeah, that I don't think that counts at all, was um, the lie detector test results from Travis Walton, and that was the most tangible evidence that they could bring forward. There's got to be better. I mean, of course, I also have to preface this question with, I don't want to put eyewitness testimony to the side as if it doesn't matter, or as if it's not evidence. I would like to classify it as a great data point, but I can't solely rely on that as evidence. So, in your opinion, in all the research that you've seen, what do you think is the one case, or the maybe cases plural, that you think, in your opinion, provides some of the most wow moments, or that science should be paying attention to this here?
Um, yeah, so I actually get asked this question quite a bit, and it's honestly one of the questions that I find the most difficult to answer, because I'll start off by saying I get labeled by a lot of people as like a skeptic or like a debunker, but that's like not really my role at all. If you actually look at my post, like I don't really ever put out debunks for cases. Like that's not what I do. I will point out if like there's explanations. But I am a skeptical guy. Like, and for me, this topic isn't really like about belief. I don't need to believe in any hypothesis to find this topic interesting. And so I find these cases interesting for a lot of different reasons that may not necessarily be that they're the best evidence out there. But as far as cases like that I recommend to people, that like the main case I recommend is the Minot Air Force Base case from October 24th in 1968. That's a case that, as far as documentation, is probably the best, if not one of the best documented cases out there. There's radar analysis. There's like radar screenshot photos of the radar screens. There a bunch of great researchers like Jan Aldrich and Tom Tullian with the Sign Historical Project went into an oral history project where they did oral interviews with a lot of the people that were involved. And there's just a massive information for that case. It's probably one of the most documented and best documented cases out there. And if people want
Well,
to learn about that, they can go to b52ufo.com. And that's got all the information you possibly need on that. That's a great case. I also like some of the other cases. One of the cases that's been called the best UFO case in history by a lot of people is the one that James McDonald was a big fan of. That's the RB-47 radar visual case in the Gulf of Mississippi, where they supposedly picked up that frequency, that signal, that IFF from the UFO. That IFF is basically, if people don't know, it's the friend or foe response. So when like radar picks up something, they send a request and the airplane responds back to let you know it's one of your planes, so you don't shoot it down or whatever. And in that case, there's these IFF responses that come back. I find those cases interesting because as you either have a problem with like radar propagation where you're picking up a stray signal that is responding with U.S. military, identification, or UFOs are hoaxing UFO identification for the military. Either way, I find those cases really interesting. But as far as like hard evidence, I don't think any of those cases still prove anything. They're just fascinating, and there's a lot of documentation for them.
Well, I mean, just because we have the time, if you'd like, I'd love for you to dive into the Minot UFO incident. I'm also going to share in the purple pill here, or the comments wherever I can share it anyway. The Minot52UFO.com website, so you guys can check that out for yourself. But I mean, this is not a case that I think people hear about a lot. So let's go ahead and take the opportunity now to talk about it, because I think it'd be fun to listen to your synopsis of that case.
Sure. Yeah, and I have a thread that I did on this one back on October 24th. I can just read you the synopsis I did for that real quick. This is Minot Air Force Base. It's in North Dakota, and it's October 24th, 1968, and it takes place over 2:15 to 5:18 a.m. There's 16 military personnel stationed throughout the Minuteman ICBM complex at Minot, and they report a very large, bright, illuminated aerial object, alternating colors from a brilliant white to orange, red, and green, with the ability to hover, accelerate rapidly, and abruptly change direction. Ground radar tracks an unidentified target correlated with a visual orange glow and radios it, saying someone is seeing flying saucers again, to the attention of the U.S. Air Force crew of a B-52H Stratofortress bomber at 2,000 feet as a UFO target 24 miles to the northwest. It shifts to 15 miles at 3:35 a.m. RAPCON alerts the pilots, instructor pilot Major Bradford Runyon and co-pilot Major James Patton, to the location of the UFO near Bow Bells, North Dakota, which the B-52 navigator, Captain Patrick D. McCaslin, observes on the radar scope, maintaining a 3-mile distance throughout the standard 180-degree turn that they make. Radar navigator Charles Ritchie captures the tracking on film as the B-52 starts to descend back to Minot Air Force Base. The UFO appears to close distance to within 1 mile at a high rate of speed, pacing the aircraft for nearly 20 miles before it disappears off the radar scope. Both B-52 UHF radios cannot transmit during the close radio encounter with the UFO, so their radios had transmission difficulties. When the radio scope film is recorded, shortly after, RAPCOM provides vectors for the B-52 to overfly a stationary UFO that is on or near the ground. After turning onto the downward leg of the traffic pattern, the pilots observe a large illuminated UFO ahead of the aircraft for several minutes. Before they turn onto the base leg over the UFO, observing it at close range. After the B-52 lands, both outer and inner zone intrusion alarms have been activated at the remote missile launch facility Oscar 7. The duration of the reported observation is over 3 hours. Other witnesses included Captain Tom Sisko Duty, James Bond, yes, that's the guy's name, Sergeant William Z. Smith, Robert O'Connor, A1C Joseph P. Jablonski, and A1C Gregory Adams, the chief of the Combat Support Group, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur J. Wellick, and who is designated as the liaison to Blue Book. He calls the report in at 4:30 p.m. after SAC investigations. An analysis of the radar scope films and the B-52 crew debriefing it, Wellick provides Blue Book with a selected radar through October 31st. On November 13th, Blue Book Chief Hector Quintanilla compiles his evaluation and then forwards the report over to SAC headquarters. It's a single-page letter that provides several possible explanations, including 11 pages of attachments cobbled together to support his conclusions. He attributes the B-52 radar contact and that loss of radio transmission to a plasma ball similar to ball lightning. And so that's basically how the government explained it, as plasma, partial ball lightning. They explained the visual sightings as like stars or Sirius and other possible aircraft that were in the sky. But it's a case with just a huge amount of information, and there's a lot of great charts and maps and photos and other things that people can check out either on that Minot website or on the thread that I put on Twitter.
I love it. Okay, so there's a couple things I as I was listening to this story. So 1968, right?
Yep.
So the pilots, when it's 3 miles out, obviously probably don't have visual on it, or at least I didn't hear that they have visual. Not even a mile out, right? They didn't actually get eyes on it until it was in front of the plane, correct?
Well, yeah, the pilots, people on the ground, it's a light. But the pilots, they were 24 hours out, and it was mostly on the radar at that point.
Right.
And when they were doing that 100-degree turn, it was on the radar. They didn't actually start to see it until it got closer to them. Yeah.
So the one thing that I find interesting about radar systems is when I think of radar systems, I think of Kevin Day in his description of what happened during the Nimitz. And then we find out later that the entire radar system on the entire fleet had just been replaced and upgraded, both from a hardware and a software perspective. So go ahead.
It was supposedly glitching too, and after they fixed the glitches and re-updated the system, then all those mysterious UFOs disappeared and didn't show up anymore.
Right. Right. So I'm curious, in this case, did anybody look at the radar systems and whether or not an upgrade like that had happened at that time as well? Maybe that could explain some of the radar hits that they were getting.
I'm not 100%. The problem, though, the thing with a lot of these like radar tracks, and a lot of people find these radar these radar speeds, like radar picked up a 6,000-mile-hour object, and we didn't have objects going that fast, so it has to be UFO. Problem is, radar isn't as definitive and like as hardcore of evidence as some people like to believe it is. Like, there's all sorts of things that can cause false radar returns, anomalous propagation. Those high speeds can be because it's actually a reflection that is picking up, like it's not the actual object moving those speeds. I mean, there's lots of things that can explain radar returns. And like I say, in this case, they figured it was some sort of plasma from either ball lightning or some kind of atmospheric plasma that interfered with the radar system.
Well, that certainly would, I think, explain not only what happens to the radar system, but what they see in front of them. And maybe even what people are seeing from the ground. Because obviously ball lightning would be a visual phenomenon of some kind, and I'm assuming there would be some kind of static charge or something like that associated with that could fuck with radar.
Well, there's some really interesting stories of ball lightning that if they were reported as a UFO story, you would think it was a UFO story. Like there's a pilot, I think it was in World War II, and they said this kind of like blue glowing orb flew kind of through the wall of their plane, and it seemed like it was intelligent. It flew around, it kind of bounced off the wall, and it like went into the instrument panel and like bounced off the window, and then like flew out the plane again, and it left again. And so many of these early ball lightning sightings like that are, like, phenomenologically speaking, identical to UFO sightings.
Yeah, well, there's another story as well from Ted Rowe, who, if everyone knows, oh God, the name of his association is NARCAP, I believe. NARCAP, and that is an association that only takes testimony from pilots. And they have a case in that archive where a ball lightning, a plasma ball, showed up in the fuselage of a commercial flight with the entire flight packed with people. And this plasma ball just dances its way down the fuselage, from the back of the plane to the front of the plane and then pops off. And
Yeah.
it freaked everyone out. And I can totally see how a story like that, once they land and they get in their cars or to their homes where their families are, they are telling them about this paranormal ball of energy that popped up in their fucking flight home or wherever they're going.
Yeah.
And then that, it's then at that point, it's a game of telephone that actually ties to something that is very, very real, but it's also really explainable as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And plasma balls and stuff are regularly described as seeming intelligent because they seem to move in some sort of intelligent pattern or way, but I don't think it's not so much as intelligence, it's just probably following like field lines and other kind of, stuff that I don't necessarily understand, but it appears to be intelligent, like to people that see it, because it's not just, it doesn't seem to be random. It seems to like be moving in some sort of way, like it's checking something out.
Now,
And another,
see, in that aspect, this is where I don't mind kind of leaning into the woo a little bit, because it's like, well, if it seems intelligent, maybe it is, because we still don't have 100% understanding of what ball lightning is, why it appears, where it comes from, what kind of conditions need to be rampant for it to show up in a fucking fuselage of a plane traveling, 500 miles per hour. Like
yeah,
that is still mysterious. Now, that's not to say, I still think it's 0.0000001% that it is intelligent, but that is fun to think about. But yes, I agree with you. It probably isn't.
yeah. I mean, some people think AI is intelligent. It's not. It's stupid. Like the things can appear intelligent because they do complex behaviors, but they're really just following
Right.
like simple rules that seem complex. Like it's emergent properties. Where very simple rules in a system can create extreme complexity. That develops from it. In fact, some people think consciousness is an emergent property, like of the brain. Like it's actually, it is your brain, but it's like an emergent property that develops on top of it. It's like epiphenomenal. But anyways,
Well,
yeah.
so
And then
then,
another thing about ball lightning is that there's some evidence that it's also harmful. So like some of these cases where we get physical damage, like burn marks and imprints and stuff. There's a guy in Hungary, I want to say, that's written a couple of books about this, and he studied ball lightning extensively. And you can find videos of his on YouTube. Even you can't understand him unless you speak Hungarian, but where he shows supposed damage of ball lightning of like these houses. Like there's a house where and this is like Hungary, like in the 80s. So like it's imagine a really 80s big old boombox speaker system. The plastic, all those discs and stuff just melted completely from supposedly this ball lightning. Burn marks in the windows or like in the walls from where ball lightning supposedly went through the wall and burned that side of the house open. Like, and all this other stuff, like melted metal that they show of supposedly ball lightning that like flew around this piece of metal. So
kind of
there's
reminds
damage
me
that
of
can
like
happen.
of the ball of plasma that the Terminator travels through.
Yeah, yeah. Or the movie Explorer. You seen that movie, 1985?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
I
with the
actually,
bubble ball.
in a space a few months ago, I was like, most underrated UFO movie of all time is The Explorers.
Yeah, I love that movie. That's great because it's the alien kids that, that's been a theory, is that these aliens are just teenagers that hijack the dad's spaceship, and that's why they're out doing things like abducting cows and just weird shit that makes no sense because it's just the teenagers pranking us. And that movie, the aliens were literally teenagers that hijacked the dad's car.
Yeah, yeah. Spoiler alert, everyone, if you haven't seen it.
Sorry, I mean
Yeah.
it's 40 years old,
No,
so
that's
come on.
okay. That's okay. I was gonna spoil it anyway. Yes, you're right. It's like, imagine if we find alien life and we come to the realization the only reason why it interacted with us is just because, like you said, it was a couple of kids who stole dad's spaceship, the keys to dad's spaceship, and took it for a joyride through the galaxy. In
Yeah,
their time, like in the time that it takes his parents to go out to dinner, they've they've contacted Earthlings. The Earthlings have created a ship to go contact them, have come to them, and then by the time they get there, that's when Dad finds out what's going on. It
Yeah.
is an awesome, awesome flick. And
And you got a young Ethan Hawke and River Phoenix and Amanda
Jerry
Peterson.
O'Connell.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a classic. Definitely check it out. So then, with the 30 years of sort of looking at this and seeing, especially just Kate, that's the first time I'd ever heard of a case of ball lightning melting things or destroying homes. That is fascinating. I gotta definitely look into that.
Yeah, I will say I because it's in Hungarian and I haven't really I had one copy of his book I kind of skimmed through that I had found a copy of, but I just look at the pictures. I don't know how strong the evidence he has proving that damage was actually caused by ball lightning, like he says, but it's interesting damage to me. Again, it looks like electrical fire damage, which I guess would make sense for ball lightning, but who knows? It's very interesting, anyways. And he's
No, that's
collected a lot of it.
yeah. I mean, it also could be a thing of somebody confusing an electrical surge for ball lightning, possibly.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, either way, I'd still like to check it out because that is interesting. Because every time I've heard of ball lightning, it's been this thing, like you said, where it seems intelligent and it's dancing around a fuselage or an airplane. That's the second time I've heard of it being in an airplane, so that's pretty interesting. But when I think of my UFO encounter when I was 13, and I think back on it now as an adult, I always wonder, well, shit, maybe that was a case of ball light, or at least this is sort of the thing that I've kind of had to lean on, is, well, shit, maybe what I saw, maybe my memory of this thing really is just a version of ball lightning or plasma ball of some kind,
yeah,
that everyone who was there just misunderstood, because in 1993 there wasn't Google, where you could just go instantly look shit up. I had never heard of the term plasma ball or ball lightning until mid 2000s maybe.
yeah.
So, but
And to be fair, that it's a rare phenomenon that still, there's not because of its rare nature, there's not a lot of legit video evidence of ball lightning. Like a lot of
right.
the videos that are alleged ball lightning that you see going around Twitter and elsewhere are CG fake. But there's not a lot of legitimate videos of ball lightning. So ball lightning, kind of like UFOs, is one of those topics where it's a rare, anomalous event that is hard to collect data on, and so it's kind of hard to. Uh, I understand how some people find that explanation for sightings doubtful because, again, it's almost like explaining a UFO with a UFO because there's such little data on actual ball lightning sightings.
Well, it's also one of those things too. I wonder if, again, can you recreate the conditions of ball lightning? It's almost like an earthquake. You can't recreate the conditions of an earthquake, but they happen.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this. I believe they have, at least to a limited extent, in the lab environment, kind of created ball lightning or plasma balls. I'm not sure the extent on that. I know Campbell Morio, that did what used to be on INS, Invisible Night School, was really interested in ball lightning and studied this a lot more than I did. But I do believe about a decade ago they recreated it in a lab, at least, and showed the mechanisms in which it could be created and which it would exist. So
yeah, no, that's great. So I'm curious because we got about 15 minutes, and again, we're going to open it to everyone here who's listening. So if you guys want to come up, ask questions to either Jeff or I, or just chime in on some of the things we've been talking about. But I'm curious. So the last 30 years of all of this research, we discussed how there's nothing, no researcher can sort of tangibly point to and say, there it is, that's the one. We've got our favorite cases, we've got our favorite moments, but but when we add a little bit of rationality, those things in I think most cases can be explained,
Hmm.
or at least have a rational explanation to them. So I'm curious. It's just like with me, like what keeps you coming back?
Well, I'll start off by saying, like, so I like a lot of people. I got into this topic pretty young. When I was a kid, I was probably about 8 or so,
Yeah,
and
same.
I lived at that time in the Bay Area, and watched a lot of like public access kind of like shows in the Bay Area, and I'd seen something on UFOs that caught my interest. And so I'd started to check out like books in the school library, whatever limited books they had, in like an elementary school library or whatever. Uh, and I kind of got really interested in the topic. And I was also very into computers, and was into a lot of the early internet, using bulletin boards, and even FidoNet, if people know what FidoNet is back in the day, the PairNet on the FidoNet system. And websites like UFO Mind. And back in those days, I was like a lot of people. I was a nuts and bolts guy. I was into the ET hypothesis. I thought there was a good chance there were spaceships, at least in some cases. And that was really my main approach to things for like a very long time. I stepped away from the topic for a while throughout college. I got a girlfriend, and a life, and did some things for a few years. But then I kind of started to get back into it in about the mid 2000s, and started just kind of absorbing all the material I could. And my approach to it started to change to where, for me, like I mentioned before, it's not really about belief. Like, I don't need any individual case, or really any case, to ultimately turn out to be ET or anything paranormal at all. Like, I find this topic fascinating from different perspectives. Like, I like to look at it from like a psychosocial perspective. I'm very interested in the various psychological and sociological mechanisms that play within the community, why people believe what they do, why beliefs get transmitted. I'm also very interested in the religious aspects and studies of the topic. UFO religions are one of the things that I study pretty heavily. Um, and but I'm still, I consider myself agnostic. I'm still open to the possibility that potentially some UFO sighting could turn out to have an explanation, like an alien visitor or something of that nature. It's just I have a bit higher standards of evidence than I used to when I was younger. And I think standards of evidence are important. But I also don't depend on any case turning out to be something anomalous to find this all interesting. Like, there's so much interesting about this topic that, it doesn't have to, whether it's alien or not, really doesn't matter to me personally. So again, I look at it almost like a folklorist would, or someone that studies mythology or legend. And I look at the history of the topic, and I try and preserve that and share that with people, whether or not any of it turns out to be alien, or whether or not we get any proof of that at some point in the future.
Is there any case that where where you find yourself being stubborn well, I know you say you don't believe it, but is there any case where you're just like, oh, this is the one, and then at some point you're like, oh wait, it's not?
Um, I mean, there's a lot of cases that are like, you kind of start off that way, and like I started off kind of that way. Like a lot of people, I used to be, when I was a kid, fascinated with the Bob Lazar story. Like, I was like, wow, that's amazing. This sounds all so good. And then I did a lot of research into it, and figured there wasn't much into it. And then when I started working on this topic full time about a decade ago, I spent a couple of years really researching it. At that point, I'd already knew, like, it was a bunk story. Sorry if there's anybody that still believes him, but at that point, I already knew that. But I kind of hoped that I could maybe figure something out that kind of could put a rest to the story for good. Well, that was foolish thinking, but yeah. So I was interested in that case. I looked, like Roswell, I was really interested in. Socorro was really interested in. There was a lot of cases that I found really fascinating. I still find really fascinating. I don't think they'll ever reach the point where there'll be proof of anything.
Yeah. I I, I feel you. What do you think? I think this is a big question. I think a lot of there's a lot of labels always thrown around for people who question things, but for these quote debunkers, the biggest question is always, well, what will it take? What kind of evidence needs to hit the table to convince a Jeff Knox or a Lou Jimenez or anyone who, Mick West?
That we have, say, an alien spaceship or
Yeah,
been visited by one. Yeah,
that something a non-human is visiting the planet, or at
yeah,
or either lives here or or is visiting us from the future. Whatever the paranormal phenomenon is.
yeah. For me, it's gonna probably take something actual physical. I know for some people, like, you don't even need a physical craft. I know, like, Robert Powell likes to talk about the argument of how, like, if you have triangulated, like, radar returns showing anomalous movements from, multiple radar stations, etc., then that's good enough to demonstrate that is, not from here. I don't, again, I don't agree with that. By that definition, the RB-47 case qualifies. A lot of these cases qualify. For me, you gotta have you need a piece of the machinery, and that machinery needs to be analyzed by public scientists, peer reviewed, and the data be published. That's what it's going to take for me to accept that we're being visited by aliens.
Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm kind of with you on that one. When I asked Mick West this, one of his something that he would love to see would be a video or an image or an event where you get hundreds of people filming it from
Yeah,
hundreds of different angles with hundreds of metadata packets, and names and addresses and eyewitness testimony, and then you analyze the video, get a 360-degree view of what you're possibly looking at, and then maybe even then you would still need more verification. But fuck, he was like, that would be, I think, a very good step. Um,
yeah, I agree with that as well.
in changing the conversation at least.
Yeah, if you had, like, yeah, video from multiple angles, high resolution, like unambiguous video, like not like a blur video of a distant object, like you can see the windows and the whatever, the rivets, or if it doesn't have rivets, and that it's unambiguous, it's not a blurry object from multiple angles, high resolution, uh and several bits of that, like, yeah, that would definitely be suggestive and worth taking notice of, that's not a fake sighting, and that's something. But even then, you could still argue that, well, perhaps it's just ultra classified black technology that we don't know about. Like,
Right, you
to
still couldn't
really prove
label it
it's
alien.
extraterrestrial or non-human, you're going to have something physical. But that kind of video evidence would definitely be suggestive, and it's interesting, like, we don't have it, considering how many cameras are everywhere.
Well, I think you do open up a scenario in which, let's say we do have some sort of amazing black tech that can display something that appears alien. The only thing you'd have to do is pop up over a major metropolitan area and do exactly that. Get hundreds and hundreds of angles and let the mob create the story for themselves. Like,
And they absolutely will.
yeah,
Like that, if you've looked at the cases I published on mass sighting events, and most of them have turned out to be, like meteorites or rocket reentry events. And the kind of sightings you get out of them are amazing. People have close encounters. People claim to see beings. They claim to be abducted. Like, and it was a rocket that re-entered over the city, and thousands of people saw it. Like, to create a mass sighting event, all you got to do is put a light in the sky, and you'll get a whole slew of crazy stories.
yeah, that's why I don't trust the Phoenix Lights incident whatsoever in the whole mass sighting event. I used to think that was a really good one, but yeah, when you see how easy humans can quickly identify something unidentified.
Yeah.
Immediately they're like, oh, I don't understand what that is. That is unidentified. And then the very next thing out of their mouth is it's alien.
Yeah. When it's
That
not.
is when you don't know. You don't know if that's what it is.
It wouldn't be
Um,
unidentified if you knew it was alien.
Correct. Yeah. No, it is absolutely fascinating to me. So I think there are little aspect and sprinkles of things like when I hear Stephen Greer talk about this false flag operation where they're going to use UFOs to create this narrative that we're being invaded when really all they're doing is just using that to birth the Space Force essentially.
Yeah.
I do believe that the sprinkle truth of that is that maybe we do have some amazingly wonderful jaw-dropping tech that looks alien. And to display your power, you pop it up over a major city, let hundreds of people see it, but never take credit for it. But behind the scenes, the intelligence that your adversaries are collecting is, oh, that's theirs. That's the new toy they got. And to me, that's almost like a very, it's like, what the nuclear bomb was in a way. In a lot of ways, that bomb was a message to the rest of the world. Game over. Like, we're in charge. Like, you're
Yeah.
gonna have to listen to what we say now. And I think if you did have a tech like that and you displayed it in a way that was very ominous and mysterious like that, where no one could see rivets or a Lockheed or American flag on the side of it, I think that would cause quite a stir, and you wouldn't have to do anything. That, like I said, the narrative would create itself. Everybody would automatically pin that as an alien craft instead of saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, wait a second. How do we know it's alien?" Like I think it would take years and honestly decades, because we've seen videos with less than that kind of standard keep cropping up years later. I mean, the MH370 is a perfect example of that. Like, that
Yeah.
video is not new, but here we are 5 years later, and it's still this big, thing in the zeitgeist because they fall for stupid shit all the time. And so, yeah, I feel like doing it would create such a can of worms, but it would also be a can of worms that the United States military would be like, I think it would welcome, because no one would point in the sky and go, holy shit, new Navy tech.
Yeah.
Nobody, not even our news organizations.
And I think that's probably one of the reasons why like the government tolerates a lot of like this UFO stuff, and like some people not into the topic might be like, why is the government even wasting time and money like with these UFO people? Like, well, because it's a good distraction. Like, even if they didn't plan it, like they'll take advantage of UFOs as a distraction, distract from other issues. And it's not even the first time that fake UFO sightings have been performed in the history. The Canadian government project, I believe, Magnet, did a fake mass UFO sighting where the goal was to kind of figure out what people reported when they saw this kind of mass UFO, which was like going to be a balloon or something. There was a project at McDonnell Douglas that Kurt Collins has written about called Project Skylight, that was to produce simulated UFOs and to be able to fake the different observables that UFOs supposedly have, using like balloons and things like that to be able to see how the people responded. There's no evidence that project ever ended up performing any of their experiments that I'm aware of, but there has been times where basically simulated UFO sightings have taken place to kind of like gauge the public's response.
Yeah. I mean, well, David Fravor even did a little version of that
Yeah,
himself when,
campfire. Yeah.
yeah, where he would, if you guys haven't heard this story, he would turn off his entire engine on his plane and just coast and glide down to a campfire that he would see in the middle of the desert. And then as soon as he got over it, he'd kick off the afterburners and take off. And then the next day they'd get UFO sightings. So that they like, and that's just somebody independently with $1 million
Oh yeah.
or $1 billion piece of hardware just deciding, oh, let me do this. Like this will be fun. But okay, so last question, and then I'm gonna open up the floor for everyone to come up, whoever wants to come up. If we could go to the UFO casino and we could play roulette, and we only could just narrow this down to red or black. Red, we have been visited on some level by an intelligence, and black being it's never happened, and all of this is just mass hysteria, the human condition, misidentifications, distractions with black tech, so on and so on. So red, real; black, not happening. What would you put your chips on?
Uh, I mean, if I had to bet, just because there's simply not the evidence, I would go with black that we haven't. But it's hard. It's hard to. You never say never, right? Like it's hard to
Right.
disprove what happened in the past. Like I can't. You can't say for certain like we've never been visited, right? Like all you
Well,
can do
look,
is prove that we have.
it's
So
okay to take your chip stack and take one or two chips and just put it on red,
yeah,
and bet both, that way you have a little bit left over to keep betting maybe a little bit later. Uh, but
yeah.
but yeah, I think personally, I'm right there with you. If I'm in the same casino and I had to be forced to pick one or the other, just based off what I've seen, what I've experienced, all of the research I've done and the people that I've spoken with, I'd have to put my chips on black too. And it wouldn't make me happy, but I know I'd walk out of that casino a much happier man than when I walked in. I might not be satisfied, in my soul, but hey, my pocket would be satisfied.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily like understand about people they like to call debunkers or skeptics is like they think that like we don't want to believe like we absolutely do, a lot of us. Like I absolutely want to think we're being visited by aliens. Like I think that would be amazing. Like I hope we've been visited by aliens. I just that's not enough for me to jump to we are and have been. Like I want
Yeah.
that to be true. I just want the evidence. I'm not scared of it. Like I'm not going to go through some ontological shock and I'm so scared and that's why I don't believe in this or that. Like no, I want it to be true. And in fact, it's because I want it to be true that I feel like I've got to kind of balance that out with some skepticism to kind of override my natural desire and confirmation bias. Because like I said, I started out like most people, like more on the belief side, a nuts and bolts guy, thinking that that we were being visited. Like I started off like everyone else. Uh,
I
that's
just
not.
love the idea of believers kind of warning everybody, like, okay, catastrophic disclosure it is, I guess, as if like, yeah, why wouldn't we want catastrophic disclosure? Like that'd
Bring
be
it
the
on.
bring it on. Like let's get on with the catastrophic disclosure. I'm ready to be ontologically shocked. Like let's get it over with. I think 80 years of this waiting for the ontological shock. I think everybody's ready. But Pip, you
Yeah. So
got your
much.
hand up, buddy. Thanks for
Yes.
being here.
Hey guys, I just wanted to talk about the meteor that was viewed over Portugal recently, and this is something that I posted about on Twitter. We had multiple angles of this same event photographed by many different people. I think that was a really good example of a mass sighting event which can be corroborated and verified through multiple witnesses. I think one of the other things that we need to consider is the fact that when we're looking for evidence, I think one of the best chances that we have is actually looking for things like technosignatures using deep space astronomy. We have some of the most powerful telescopes in the world being produced right now. There's two that are going to be coming online in the next 2 to 3 years. One which is called the Very Large Telescope. I think one of them is called the Extremely Large Telescope. So they've got some very unique ways of naming these things. But I think that even then, if we did get evidence of there being life on another planet elsewhere, that wouldn't necessarily mean that we could prove that it visited us here. And I think that one of the questions that I'm asked as a skeptic a lot is, why won't you believe, why isn't the evidence that we believe that provides us certainty enough for you? What would it take for you to believe? What evidence would you consider to be enough? What would be enough for you? And I think that again, one of the things that happens a lot is this idea of getting away from sort of case by case basis. Is I think that to prove that aliens are visiting here, you need to find something physical. I think that's the only way that you're ever going to really actually prove it, because I think even video it is not necessarily going to be enough for you to reach that conclusion. Photographs and video are very useful, and it might give you an indication that something happened, but it's not really a very good source of data to provide sort of scientific and verified conclusions. So, I don't think it will be a video or a photograph that will necessarily tip the balance. I think it has to be something physical. I think it has to be some metallurgical or physical signature that allows us to identify something as being not from here. I think that's the only way that we're really going to sort of be able to reach that conclusion that something is alien. And that's really the crux of the problem, is that that it does require something quite extraordinary to happen. And if you consider the history of the subject, and you consider the Portuguese meteor incident, we haven't had even something like that for a UFO case in the entire history of mankind. We've never had a video or a photographic record of an event, of a UFO sighting, that even matches something as simple as a meteor flying through the sky, which lasted for about 4 seconds, but was still witnessed by lots of different people. And when it comes to things like UFO crashes and stuff like that, the fact that there's never any evidence to support those claims, when if you think about the amount of times that people have captured meteors and all sorts of things, landing on the ground or coming very close to doing so, it does sort of, is it just a coincidence or just a bummer that no one's kind of captured it, or is that an indication of the fact that there isn't a there? And I think that my conclusion, if I'm going to make the bet, is that there isn't a there.
So you're going black. You're betting on black. Real quick, I two things. First, Jeff, do you see the little speaker button on your phone?
Yes.
Okay, so when you're not speaking, just pop that and it'll mute you, so that way nobody gets echoed out.
Sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Totally good. And then the second thing I was going to say, just to combat a little bit of what you were saying, Pip, is I kind of disagree with that. A video wouldn't really move the needle, because we saw what those pyramids did. I mean, my mother called me when those pyramid videos hit the news stream. And that was just like chaos unleashed as far as bad information into the public. I see a video like that and what it did to sort of stir up the media. If we had a video, again, multi-angled stationary craft hovering over a major city with hundreds and hundreds of people filming it at the same time, I think I agree. I wouldn't want anybody to jump to conclusions, but I think that would definitely move the needle. I think that would be something that people might talk about for weeks, maybe even longer. I don't know. I think it would be compelling. I don't think it's evidence, but it would be a hell of a lot more compelling than drones disguised as flying pyramids.
But it would have to be an unambiguous craft, right? Because there have been cases like, I don't know if you guys remember the Dome of the Rock, supposedly UFO mass sighting in Jerusalem, where there was allegedly video from multiple people, but they were all in on it.
Correct.
And even then, it was just kind of like a light. Like you'd have to actually see this legit craft.
Right, right.
And I will say it is interesting because that meteor in Portugal, which was a beautiful, beautiful meteor sighting, I have to admit, when I first saw that, I almost wondered if it was CG fake, like if somebody was trolling. And then I Googled and found, no, this is a legit sighting that lots of people had. But it was beautiful. But like I said, we don't have anything like that. We can somehow record very rare events like that, or red sprites, or other rare astronomical or meteorological events, and we've recorded them several times, despite them being extremely rare, on multiple camera systems. But we have yet to pick up something like that for a legit UFO sighting. And I just want to also comment real quick on the techno signatures. I agree. I'm actually a big fan of SETI. A lot of the UFO community hates SETI. And I think that's because, again, they believe UFOs are already here. Why do we need to bother looking for techno signatures and extraterrestrial life elsewhere if it's already visiting us? I don't agree with that perspective. I think it's very important that we look for these signatures elsewhere. I visit the Hat Creek Observatory, SETI's Hat Creek Observatory, many times. They know me there, actually. I've been to the Very Large Array in New Mexico many times. In fact, the next time I'm there, I plan on shooting a video inside the control room and inside some of the towers, because I've made contacts with some of the people that work there. So I'm a big fan of the SETI project, and I think more of the UFO community should be supporting it instead of bashing it.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And also, I can't wait for the ludicrously large satellite telescope in space. Craft Beer, we'll go to you because your hand was up next, and then we'll go to VC and then back to Pitt.
Thank you. Hey, Jeff. So I have two questions. I hope that's okay. First one, I wrote it down just so I wouldn't forget. Can you think of any major methodological differences between the way that you approach your work with UFO history versus someone else like Richard Dolan?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, because for me, I try and approach it kind of the way like an historian should. I try to eliminate any bias, and I'm just kind of trying to present the historical record. I'm not trying to present my kind of opinion or necessarily like analysis on it. So kind of in that way, I'm almost, like I said, more like an archivist. I'm more collecting the historical record and sharing it and sharing what's out there, and not trying to push my views on other people, not trying to tell someone that case is true or not true, or anomalous, not anomalous. I just try to present the information that's out there and let people look at it and make those decisions for themselves. Dolan takes more of a bias kind of approach, like he's trying to present the mystery and the anomalous nature of all these things. And that's one way to do it. That's just like not really my way to do it.
Thank you. And then second question. Do you think interpreting historical accounts of mysterious objects in the sky through a UFO lens is an anachronistic reading of history, or do you think it's a legitimate lens by which to try to understand accounts? To try to understand accounts prior to the 1900s?
Oh, I absolutely think it's an anachronistic look at history. And I actually talk about that quite a bit, because one of my interests is in like supposed UFOs and like things like Renaissance paintings and woodcuts and things like that. And I think it's, in fact, problematic to try and go back and reinterpret, people's past experiences under a kind of modern UFO lens. And I don't think we should be doing it. That's one of the issues I have with like the work of Jacques Vallée and stuff, in the books like Wonders in the Sky, right? Like so much of this stuff, if you take it outside of the context in which it's presented and try and repaint it like with a UFO lens, for example, those Renaissance paintings, right? People like, that's a UFO, look, it's a flying saucer. And if you don't actually understand a little bit of art history and like the cultural context and the religious significance and the biblical symbology that's being painted there, then yeah, you can think it's a flying saucer. But it absolutely is not a flying saucer. It was never a flying saucer. In fact, it was never an event that even happened. This is not a photograph. It's a painting of biblical imagery. And in some of these other cases, like the famous Nuremberg event, it's doubtful that was even an event that happened. It may have just been an allegory being told for political purposes. So, yeah, I think it's wrong to go back and try and relook at all these old, weird, mysterious events in the sky and repaint them as UFOs.
That's excellent answer. Thank you. And just for clarification, because I know anachronistic is more of a academic term. Like, can you describe what that means in the context of history?
I mean, like I said, if you don't understand the context, you're to understand, like I said, those paintings, you've really got to understand the history of the time, why people were painting them. They were painting them, for example, a lot of those artists, they weren't painting what they wanted to paint. They had patrons, and they had very strict criteria in which they had to paint under. They had to paint according to very specific biblical symbology and imagery. And that's why you get a lot of this imagery and those kind of things that get confused as UFOs get repeated in different kind of paintings from different artists, because they're all painting the same kind of imagery. One of the examples is like the dove and the that you see coming down from the sky. People say that's a saucer coming down in a beam of light. No, that's the spirit of God descending upon, like, the ray of heaven. It's an angel, basically. It's a messenger. So if you don't actually understand that history and you create a whole new history behind these things, it's bogus. It's fake history that doesn't match what really happened. You're presenting, it's a false history, essentially. It's not real. You have to understand the history.
Great questions. I was going to say real quick before we get to VC Smart, or if you have something to add, Pip, we can get to what you're going to add real quick. But before you do, guys, please do me a favor. I think this is a wonderful conversation. Share the hell out of it. Tell people that we're having it. This will be great for replay. I'm going to also post this to the YouTube channel and to the podcast. So if you don't follow me on those platforms, please do check out the show. We do a space every Thursday, and our YouTube live streams on Mondays and Fridays. So yeah, with that said, Pip, you could quickly chime in there, or if not,
No,
we
I
can
think
go back to VC.
Swing it to VC. I think
Great.
I'd be interested to hear what he says.
Yeah, what do you got, Smart?
Okay, I'm just going to say, since we sort of get distracted on different topics as I'm waiting there, I'll comment on one thing just now with the artwork that hasn't been brought up yet. That's a real important point too, that Pulsoka Diana mentions too, and that's the idea of redaction. Even in the period of history, the artwork's being done, and she uses some famous painting where there's an angel that's being depicted that a nun was seeing, and it might have been associated with an orb, seeing orbs and things, and that was just the way that the artist wanted to depict the image of it being in a much more friendly, angelic vision. But that's not at all what they found out in that was being redacted from what was really being said by the nun about her experience with this being, which turned out to be way more a frightening experience, and the instrument or arrow or rod, whatever it was carrying, stuck into her abdomen area, and it was quite painful, and all of these things which you would never have picked up from the artwork. So even during the period of history that these things are being done, they have to fit a certain definition that's acceptable to the church, but might not have anything to do with what the witness testified to. And so, it's very hard to get at what actually was experienced. The other thing, jumping more forward into the present day terms, I think Jeff might have known of this, but I saw in the one of the flight museums. I don't know if it's the one in D.C., the Smithsonian one, or some other locale in the United States, but one of these historic flight museums. And there's a aircraft that was a prop aircraft, but even in 1929, this thing looked like a beautiful UFO. Okay, and it was apparently flight capable. So even in 1929, at the beginning of the birth of flight, there were craft flying around, powered flight, that looked just like a UFO. So to me, that tells a lot about what also could be happening in modern times with all the drone technology and the GPS control of these things, and the fact that, experimental aircraft, people can build, whether it's a drone or an aircraft they're going to fly to mimic a UFO easily. And I don't, I wouldn't put it past some. There's so many millionaires nowadays and people that love to fly, that there's people out there already that have like UFO like craft somewhere in a hangar that they just take out on joy rides to do whatever. I mean, I think there's a hoaxing industry related to this. This is being done in marketing. I think I've mentioned this once before in another space, but people, several years ago, there was this horror clown movie that was coming out, and the way they promoted the film was they put all these clowns, actors all around the United States to stand out and act really creepy, and they were actually being accused of being child molesters, and police searches were instigated to try and find these clowns and everything, and it was just a big hoax to promote the movie. So what's to say that, people are not, there's a lot of people that like to pull pranks, and there's money in this business. So I think it's very hard to distinguish, what would be a real ET craft in the sky, even if that I think it's capable of flying things like that now with this type of technology I've just been talking about. That's all.
Hey, real quick, VC. I was listening to you in Shane's space a little earlier, and I got to say, the examples that you use, I absolutely love listening to. So I appreciate your perspective. I'm curious. Are you comfortable? What is your background? How did you get into the topic, into the discussion? Just out of curiosity.
Well, the main reason why I got into it really is just sort of my own personal experiences. I mean, I was at 12 years old when I mentioned those two Jungian UFOs, and I really didn't know why at the time I saw those things or anything like that. And then at times in my life, we've all talked about the idea of stress and trauma causing these paranormal events or UFO things coming about. And I got away from the whole field. I was researching it again back around 2015 timeframe, and that's when the Roswell slides thing came out, and I saw that was a big fraud at the time, and I just can't believe people talking about Jaime Maussan and these mummies that have come up again. Because if they just research that one story, they'd know how crazy that whole thing is. And also, I don't even understand. I've even seen some people that seem to be Native Americans that were interested in this story, and I wonder just how they feel themselves about their ancestors being dug up in criminal circumstances, and then getting interested in the topic too. I mean, it seems like sacrilege to be doing this kind of stuff. Why even people want to give it uh, publicity or whatever? It That seems bizarre to me. But yeah, so I've had some paranormal experiences too, but I see that as, I understand that from a Jungian psychology point of view, because I've always been interested in psychology and why people believe the things they do. Also, when I saw that craft that I told you is an unknown craft, that I know lots of people that want to believe in ET, they would absolutely still swear that 10 or 20-second craft that I saw up in the late 90s, even though I think that was some sort of stealth or drone technology, because there were no navigation lights on it and all that. That got me interested in the topic again, just because that was such an interesting sighting. And I even went, and that was a time frame when Art Bell was really popular. So I would listen to him on the radio at night on these programs. And I can't remember the guy's name up in Seattle state area, Everett or something like that, Washington. He took all these reports for UFO sightings. And I went into his database to do that report for that. And I saw that other people in my area where I lived were seeing sightings similar to what I saw. So, I believe it was something that was real up there. But yeah, it's just I don't. I see it as like a political agenda. That's what Jeff mentioned too a little bit. That politicians and I was saying that earlier in the space. They use this to keep up the paranoia and also the military interest in this. This is a way to get more money to the military. That's what I was trying to say. That the position or the crazy contrast where a lot of these people are anti-government and they want the government to be responsible for this stuff, and yet they're helping the government along to keep these secret programs and build up the paranoia by propagating all this ET stuff. So it gives the people that are in the military, industrial, and entertainment complex a reason to do this too. I mean, it's to make more money. So if you can, you can protect your secret weapon systems, and at the same time, when needed, you can create distractions within the populace. I mean, is it any surprise that when Trump gets in about 2016, that this whole thing takes off with the UFOs too? I mean, I see that as not a coincidence. I see that the society being stirred up psychologically, that these things come in. The UFO and all these things will start to be a thing. That's what I was trying to say personally in my own life. When I have stress, I'll start to look at these things again. And I see it culturally wide too, that influence our whole culture that way. So we're very susceptible to things like these distractions coming and taking place that way. So yeah, it's interesting to me why people believe the things they do, and I wish that we could get more clarity about it from a psychological point of view. That's the other thing that's so frustrating with me. Nobody approaches this problem that way, and also nobody really investigates the investigators or their backgrounds or why people could be seeing these things. It's always just from one point of view. And that's sort of why I got interested in the space thing. It's just to see what other people are thinking, to the ways to explore this, because it's a dead end topic. Most of the ways it's been done so far. Okay, that's enough.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I'll tell you this, I really appreciate your vulnerability in that, in sharing the fact that you correlate your stress with looking even more into the topic. And I think that's an important thing to highlight in the discussion these days, especially in these spaces, because I really don't think a lot of people realize that they're doing that themselves. And I think I do as well. So I love when moments like that are shared. And there are people doing spaces that are much different from the ones you're getting rejections from, Smart. So I'll just say that, I would say check out, everyone here. Everyone here, I think, is a person you should follow on some level to get both sides of this conversation in a rational, calm way when you want to, when the rationality and the calmness is presented and given. When it's not given, I think that's when conversations sort of divulge into fucking knuckle dragging. But I appreciate everything you've said so far in the few spaces that I've heard you in. So just know that, yeah, there's plenty of room for discussions like this. And honestly, I think this is where the more fun discussions are being had. And I'm curious to bounce it back to craft in the idea of people relieving stress in, I guess I'll just call it a hobby, the idea of ufology. I think ufology is a hobby. I don't think it's a genuine science or any sort of merit of study yet. Is that fair? Is it fair to call this thing a hobby? What is that? What do you guys think? Is hobby fair?
I think so.
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quick, kind of about what Visa was saying. Something that I had posted just 2 days ago that I was reading in a paper by Eddie Ballard. where he says here, folklorist Bill Ellis, and Bill Ellis wrote a great paper on cattle mutilations as well, but he says he finds a favorable comparison between the state of the mind described by people that undergo a religious conversion and the mental conditions reported by people like Whitley Strieber during periods of abductions, for example. He says symptoms of acute anxiety, stress, and excitement, a kind of mental overload, are common in both situations. So it is a great relief that this resolution provides. And whether this resolution is religious or alien, whether it's true or false, makes very little difference. All that matters is that the concept somehow gives a sense of direction to an otherwise chaotic emotional turmoil that the person is going through. And I pointed out that you see this a lot, like in UFO Twitter, is that a lot of people come to this topic after periods of, strong emotional stress. Maybe they had a drug addiction or they had family issues. And this topic basically gave them that sense of direction and purpose in life.
I will say again, before I bounce into craft, I cannot tell you how many times I've heard the confession of a either very, very serious, like high level class drug addiction to a casual marijuana addiction to a casual alcohol and serious alcohol addictions. I feel like there's a lot of addiction in this conversation. Craft, I'm curious to know, what do you think about when I say that? And I'm also curious to know, are you writing a book on this subculture? Because you are interacting with it and trying to understand it. And I'm curious to know, in this last 2 months that you've been in this space, what are I don't mean for you to diagnose the subculture, but what are you pulling away from the discussions that you've had? Am I way off base when I say something like that?
No, I am not writing a book about UFOlogy.
Well, not ufology, but I think the subculture, the people who follow it.
I'm not writing any kind of book. I genuinely
you should think about it.
Thank you. I was in Shane's space earlier. I actually made a comment that I was just thinking recently about what is it that I get out of joining these spaces? Why have I been doing it so much? And I was able to kind of realize it's because, well, my day-to-day job exposes me to a lot of really fucked up heavy stuff. And this is an escape for me. It feels lighter and like less serious. And it takes my mind off of the trauma that I have to deal with. So at least for me, it is an escape.
That says something about the world.
No, that is, I tell you, man, that hits home. And I don't love hearing that, because that means obviously you never think about the trauma of the therapist that's giving the help has to endure. I'm sure. I mean, how many clients do you see a day, Andres?
Depends on the day, but the jail has 220 people and there's only me. So if you do the math, that's a lot.
Wow, at least one a day, if not more. It's 365 days a year. Try to do it, maybe 3 times each person if you can. If we're being gracious, 3 a day.
4 or 5.
4. Wow, 4 or 5. So you're really hustling through it.
Yeah, and I think also it exercises just a different part of my personality and mental, like brain muscle, because the philosophy part of me is also a big aspect of who I am. So when I'm in spaces, sometimes I have to kind of remember that the way that I talk here reflects on my profession. Even though I'm not here as a therapist, I see myself here as like engaging in ideas and skepticism. But it exercises my philosophical kind of brain, because a lot of this topic does touch on a lot of philosophical issues. So that's another way something else that I get out of it is that intellectual stimulation.
Well, yeah, it sounds like on some levels the therapist is getting a little therapy, or at least some therapeutic aspect to it, because like you said, it is so much lighter. It is so much easier to deal. It's almost like going from a video game that you put on the hardest setting just to see what it was like, and then you do it for 20 minutes and then you go just back to normal and you're like, oh God, this is way better. This is
Yeah.
much easier to deal with right now, and I'd much rather do this. Wow. Okay, that's a
Can I?
wonderful answer. Because I was also wondering, I'm like, oh, I'm curious to know. But with that said, you know, what do you see, having spent 2 months in this, like, are there, man, I don't know how to ask this question without just straight up asking it. Like, what's your diagnosis on the subculture? Fuck, dude, like, what's going
It
on
is
here?
extremely
Why is it
dysfunctional. It is
extremely
extremely
dysfunctional?
dysfunctional. Yes,
Yeah.
I do. I do have a question for Jeff. I want to, because I want to pick his brain. I would love to answer
Yeah.
your questions, but I do have a question to Jeff because he has expertise that I don't, and I'm curious what he thinks about something.
Yeah.
So going back to my last question, Jeff. So I know that typically the response that you're going to get from people is ancient peoples were simply describing what they were seeing through the language and concepts that they had available to them. But essentially, they were talking about the same things that ufology is, simply through their concepts and language. Now, I know that you just can't do that historically. But I'm curious how you typically would respond to that yourself as a historian.
So yeah, that's one way that's one of the ways that people respond, and I think the problem is that they are doing the exact same thing essentially. They're basically assuming that their modern beliefs are true and the way they perceive things is the truth, and they're going and essentially stealing those people's experiences and reimagining it in their own views. And so that's, I mean, that's kind of like uh, a postmodern like kind of way of like looking at things where you can just kind of go back and reinterpret it and like, oh no, yeah, they're talking about spaceships. They just didn't know there were spaceships back then. And I don't think that's fair to those people's experiences. And I don't think it's, realistic to the context that those experiences took place in to go and reimagine them in that way. I will recommend people check out the pinned tweet on my profile is an article in Fortean Times from back in October 2022. That's actually on this issue where I'm quoted talking about this. And I reference a paper in there called The Art of Imagining UFOs. That was in Skeptic magazine, written by Diego, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Cuoghi. And it's a really great short article I recommend people read. And it talks about how the issues with people nowadays trying to reimagine people's past experiences with kind of through our own perspectives. And I don't think that's a fair, reasonable way to look at things. Because you don't know, you can't question those people, and how do you know that those experiences are even accurate? And in most cases, it's not even that we have an actual experience. Like, we're going off like a painting or or a piece of rock art, even if you want to go way back. And so there isn't even really a story. Like, even outside of the UFO topic, a rock art is actually one of my main hobbies. I've got a whole shelf of book on rock art research, and from symposiums on rock art research. Like, it's one of my main interests, actually. And there's still a bit of subjective interpretation that goes on with trying to interpret any kind of imagery that you see that comes from the past, because we can't talk to those people. We don't know why they drew it. We don't know if they were drawing something they actually saw, or if there's a bit of artistic license to it. We just don't know. And so you can speculate all you want, but it's you're doing the same thing essentially.
So can I ask you? So, for example, the most famous example they use is the Anunnaki, right? How do you explain this to someone in a bite-sized way? Because it takes a while to explain why this is just not the way that you can do history. How would you explain it in a bite-sized way?
I'm not an expert on the Anunnaki, but my understanding and what I would tell people is that people that have read Sitchin's work is that the translations are just completely inaccurate, that they should actually go look at some academic scholars that have properly translated that kind of material, because it doesn't really present the same story that you get from the work of people like Zachariah Sitchin. There's a scientist, or not a scientist, a biblical scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser, who I believe has written on some of the translation issues that Zachariah Sitchin does with like the Anunnaki stuff.
Does that
And you,
also go for Van Doniken?
oh, yeah, absolutely. And Van Doniken's not even original, of course. Like he
Right.
ripped it off from like Mornings of the Magicians and older theosophical stuff, even like, yeah. So a lot of this stuff is a lot of these people, and a lot of pseudo-archaeology in general, is that they, because this stuff happened so long ago, they kind of feel like that free reign to reinterpret it any way they want to sell whatever kind of story, you know, that they want to sell, even though that's just not what the evidence points to. So yeah, I don't know if that's
Thank you.
exactly what you wanted, but
Yeah, thank you. And I highly recommend Dr. Heiser's work. Yeah, his work is amazing. So thank you.
yep.
Hey guys, just you don't have to go with hands. I trust this group not to talk over each other. So I know Pip, you're up next, but yeah, I mean, feel free to jump in whenever you guys want.
Yeah, the point that I was going to make, we've moved on a little bit, and so we might have to rewind just a little.
That's okay. I think
If
we
that's
could all
okay.
we all
I
get
just
it.
wanted to sort of salute VC for his comments, and I think you know, that really resonated, and also with craft beer. I think, you know, you're right. This is a fascinating subject that touches upon so many different aspects of our culture and our knowledge and sort of our understanding of things. And to that point, one of the things I wanted to ask Jeff about, or maybe just the group in general, is if you've ever one thing that we need to sort of understand about this conversation in this community is it's very competitive. There are lots of people vying for attention. There are lots of people who are trying to monetize this space, who are trying to garner followings, influence, attention, engagement, for all sorts of different reasons. And within a competitive environment, one of the things that is emergent within that is game theory, and you know, it's not something that everyone agrees with, but it does sort of provide some interesting takes. One of the aspects of game theory, and VC, you mentioned something about this, and when you were speaking about this idea that, you know, we're being distracted, or sort of it's convenient. There's like an external force that's at work here, and actually, I think it's more of an emergent quality of the nature of the competition itself. Because one of the things about game theory, and it's an interesting aspect of it, is this idea of Moloch. Moloch is a representative of a destructive force within a competitive environment. He's actually represented as a pagan god in the Canaanite sort of times, but for the purpose of understanding here, it represents a sort of a destructive force. And what it explains is a kind of an emergent quality of competition where people are pitted against each other in a race to the bottom, and where ultimately everybody loses that game. A good example is where, imagine a river, and there's 3 factories on the river. They're all highly regulated, and they all measure the water quality as well, to make sure that, you know, to see what the other factories are doing. One of the factories realizes that, you know what, if I don't stop these chemicals spilling into the river, the fines that I get are actually going to be less than the profits, and so they start dumping chemicals into the river. And then, you know, the next factory down, who's measuring the water, finds out that they're putting their chemicals in the water. So that, well, if they're doing it, I'll do it too. And slowly, before you know it, all the factories are dumping chemicals into the water. The water is contaminated, and then the factories can't actually operate because they don't have the water to work anymore. So it's how people who are competing against each other, and I think affect the game. And I think what we can see here within this community is that there is this race to the bottom, because it essentially describes within the context of this discussion, the preponderance of bad ideas, bad behavior, bad data, bad evidence being accepted, and being, everyone's sort of, because everyone's vying for that attention, people are, willing to do anything to get, what they want. And I think that describes how we are where we are today with regards to, that levels of evidence that people are willing to accept. And also the people involved, like Jeremy Corbell. I think that's a very kind of, Jeremy Corbell is an emergent quality of this competitive environment, and he is essentially a indicator of the Moloch force at play. And so it's almost like within game theory and within competition theory, you can see the trajectory of where this conversation is going. And I'm just wondering, Jeff, whether you recognize that within this space, having seen it sort of evolve over time, and also is there any way in which we can solve that problem to sort of reintroduce some level of standards of evidence, or to raise back the game, rather than this sort of inevitable, inexorable drive to the bottom? Is there a way in which we can kind of halt that or stall that in any way?
One would hope that would be nice. The problem is, the way I see things is that this topic kind of happens in cycles where we get these cycles where there seems to be progress being made. There's more attention. There even seems to be more scientific efforts that are kind of starting to take place to, look at this phenomenon. And then eventually things fizzle out or die, or we get to a point again where it's people are more interested in the personal testimony, the anecdotal evidence, than any sort of actual physical science-based search for evidence. And don't get me wrong, there's value to anecdotal testimony. Like, we need eyewitness testimony sometimes to find patterns, to know where to look for, better evidence. So there's absolutely value to that. But I haven't seen in the, almost 80 years that the topic's been going on, that there's really been any deep progress made towards pushing for higher standards of evidence. There's been some times where I was hopeful. I was hopeful when SCU was created out of the disaster that was a MUFON conference that embraced the secret space program. I was very hopeful that we were going to get some good science-based work on this topic that had higher standards of evidence. Unfortunately, a lot of the times when we do start to see scientists come into this topic, or we see groups that allege to be scientific, they're really just using that science in favor of their biased conclusions. So, like, there's a lot of very smart people at SCU, for example, like, that know the physics and the math and all that stuff much better than I do. But you can still, without even, necessarily knowing that math, you can still see almost kind of like these traits or signatures where their methodology is bad, where they're like doing things backwards, or where, groups that supposedly be scientific are kind of starting off with the assumption that it's anomalous and mysterious, and then use that science to try and prove that, instead of, when that's basically kind of backwards. I don't know how we fix it, or, because there's been many people that have been calling for higher standards of evidence for a long time, and I just don't see a whole lot of progress on it. I see a lot of people dressing things up in the trappings of science, but not actually doing real science.
Hey, Jeff,
Go for it.
Sorry,
Go for it. No, go.
So you said something interesting that I've been wondering about. So obviously ufology kind of comes in little flaps and it's cyclical. And one thing that I often hear is that there's something different about this one, starting from 2017 until the present day, that there's something just fundamentally different about how far we've gotten this time. And I'm just curious, from your perspective as a historian, is this cycle different in any fundamental way than the ones we've seen before, or is it just, is that an illusion?
So like we pointed out at the beginning, there are some differences. Like I say, there's been laws passed that we perhaps haven't seen before. there's been perhaps more mainstream media coverage, particularly from people like pilots that had experiences like David Fravor, for example. But how much of that is a change in the topic, and how much of that is a change in just the media environment and the culture that we exist in today? And I don't think it's a change in the topic. I think all that is just because we have a more interconnected, media environment with the internet and whatnot. I'd say the last kind of flap where there was the disclosure, would have been 20 or so years ago when Dr. Greer had his big disclosure kind of event. And people were really hopeful back then. And then, of course, fizzled out and nothing ever happened. I think the only really difference now is just that there's more people in the world. We've got the internet and social media, and we're more connected. But I think that probably likely explains any of the differences that we see. I have not seen anything really fundamentally different than in the past.
I've been involved in the in this space and in this conversation for nearly 40 years now, Jeff, as myself. It feels as though ufology ate a bad burrito, and it's kind of repeating on itself ad infinitum over the past decades.
I call it zombie world. Yeah,
I do feel as though like Dave Grush is a smartened up version of Bob Lazar. The story is exactly the same. The claims are the same. I think there seems to be a sense of deja vu constantly with this. If you're paying attention, in the sense that that the faces may change, the clothes may change, the presentation may change, the credentials may change, but the story's always the same, and it's always the same old stories.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's essentially true. I mean, and people say like, well, we've got these military whistleblowers and stuff now. Well, it's not exactly like this is the first time we've had high up people in the military that have talked about this stuff either. We've had plenty of people with credentials over the years talk about this stuff. And David Grush is essentially, he is kind of like a Bob Lazar, only someone that at least we know did work for the government. We can verify those credentials to an extent. And the problem I see also these days is this whole idea of credentials. We need to stop, appealing to credentials, because as we've seen throughout the last 77 years, there have been multiple people with credentials and high up that have said a lot of crazy things and believe a lot of crazy things. Like people need to stop confusing people's personal beliefs with their credentials. People, I think, in this topic, they look at somebody's credentials and they assume this person is talking from personal knowledge that they know because of that high up position. When a lot of the time, I think these people are just sharing their personal beliefs that doesn't actually come from any direct knowledge, and the community confuses it and assumes it's knowledge that they got from being in the government. People look at like that guy Paul Hellyer that was Minister of Defense in Canada, and they talk about this is the highest level guy ever to admit believing in aliens. Only you find out none of that actually comes from his career. That happened in his old age. His grandson gave him Corso's book, and he read it and got really into the UFO topic. So none of his knowledge actually comes from being a Minister of Defense for Canada. So we need to get away from this appeal to credentials and start demanding actual evidence from people that come forward, because all this is again, it's a repeat of people coming forward telling the same kind of stories that they've been telling for decades.
One thing I would add too about the trends that people are curious about, how it might be changing, or is remember that somebody mentioned it in the previous space or something, where there was an author in the last 10 years or so, I think he was a MUFON person, and he came out with a book on how UFOs are now shaping as more triangular shape rather than the traditional round saucer shape.
David
And
Marler.
yeah, and so this follows along the trend, with military changes in our society culturally. I mean, these secret weapons are now exposed into the public. They're not kept hidden away. We know about the B-1 bombers and the drones and things. And two other things I see trending now that they seem to be wanting to integrate. And when they're talking about all this NHI stuff or non-human intelligence, well, guess what? They're trying to push into the agenda now. AI, artificial intelligence. They're trying to bring that concept into play with this as well. And then the other aspect too that I think they're bringing in from a sort of a military angle is the underwater unidentified objects. That's a place, because see, you can't see them, you can't really easily document them, so that sort of removes all the hysteria from the public above the surface, where you can create all this fakery and everything. So I think people have an agenda to kind of legitimize it some way from that angle. It's just the way our culture shifts, but I see those as trends. I don't know what that's going to play out as, but I think it's worth monitoring.
I just want to read one other thing that calls to mind from that paper from Ballard that talks about how we see these things. Like we saw people saw airships, at the end of the 1800s, and then saucers and triangles, etc. And he says here, witnesses learn the UFO ideas current in society. They internalize them and come heavy laden with expectations to any observation or experience they may have, especially in an ambiguous or unfamiliar situation. All our lives, we learn about UFOs from sources such as movies, newspapers, cartoons, and word of mouth. Even abductions or elements of the abduction scenario have ample precedent in movies and literature, while published reports of abduction and TV movies depicting the Hill case have exposed millions to the idea and the details of this experience. UFOs are a pervasive part of modern culture. Some knowledge of them affects anyone who has not been raised amongst the wolves or on a desert island. So the possibility exists that these similarities in UFO narratives trace to social causes rather than physical causes. The psychosocial school has rung an alarm that the rest of ufology has failed to heed. And I think that's true because what we see tends to fit with what we expect to see, based on our current, technological developments and our cultural ideas. And so when we see an ambiguous light in the sky, back in the day, we may have interpreted it as an airship or a saucer, or now it might be a triangle or some other kind of UFO craft. We tend to explain things that are inexplicable to us using the concepts that are available to us at the time.
Follow-up question to that, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
So you spoke of the airships, and I was wondering, where would you, as a UFO historian, place as roughly the start date of UFOlogy before it starts to become kind of an anachronistic reading?
I'd say the start of, and again, this is hard because people have always seen things they can identify in the sky. They always will see things they can identify in the sky. So in a sense, the UFO phenomenon is something that people seeing things they can identify has always existed. The start of modern ufology, though, is typically more considered around the summer of 1947. We had those airship cases, and the airship situation, many of those, I think were just more either meteorite sightings that people had experiencing what's called the airship effect. And in many of those cases, it was also basically they were hoaxes, or just they were journalistic hoaxes that journalists would write stories, journalism just for entertainment purposes. So, and again, there were certainly people that probably saw things in the sky they couldn't identify, and because airships were the technology of the time, that's how they interpreted them. But the modern era, I start pretty much where everyone else starts. There's the Foo Fighters, of course, during World War II, the ghost planes in the 1930s, and the ghost rockets and stuff in like 1946. But as far as when we start to really consider what we think of UFOs today as like a craft that's kind of coming here from perhaps elsewhere, I'd say that starts around 1947, summer of 1947.
Thank you. Now, last question is, how much bad history is in this field? So obviously there's a lot of bad science, but when you read a normal UFO book, how much do you tend to run into stories that are just repeated and repeated and over and over and over again that are just false? How much bad history would you say there is?
An extremely massive amount, most of it. to be honest. It's a horrible problem. Almost all UFO books do what I call copy and paste like storytelling, where one book, perhaps Kehoe told it in one of his books, and Kehoe is notorious for getting details wrong, getting names wrong, getting locations wrong, getting basically just the facts wrong. And then, a half a dozen or a dozen books would repeat that claim ad infinitum throughout UFO history. And this happens all the time. This is why I think it's absolutely critical that when you read something in a book to not take it as fact. You need to go look at the source documents, the original documents as contemporaneous at the time as possible, and try to get to the real story, because this is a serious problem. And even many of your favorite UFO authors and respected researchers get details wrong. To this day, I still find errors in like Hynek's books. I find errors in like Dolan's books. I find errors in people's books like on a almost weekly basis. So it's a serious issue. There's a lot of really, really bad history in this topic. And some of it is even intentional, where there's a level of people that leave stuff out because it contradicts the narrative that they're trying to push in their book that they're selling, and the narrative that they're giving in lectures. And so that's why it's really important to check the source material. And unfortunately, a lot of UFO books are badly sourced. They're not properly, they don't have proper bibliographies. And that's why when I do my post, I not only provide a summary, I provide all the sources, and not just a list of them. I give you all those sources, the pages from those sources, so you can go look at all that original material yourself and see if it matches what I'm telling you or what these other books are telling you. And if you just look at any of my posts, you'll find the details will vary from on a single case will vary from source to source. So yeah, it's a serious issue that a lot of people just aren't aware of, and so they take these details as fact and then just repeat them, and they continue to repeat them.
Jeff, I'm fascinated by the sort of creation of modern mythology within culture. I'm a huge sci-fi fan, always have been. To what extent do you think sci-fi, especially maybe the early writings within the sort of early 19th century or late 19th century into the 20th century, and the sort of evolution of sci-fi into modern culture, to what extent do you think that charts and correlates to the subsequent and kind of emergent evolution of the UFO phenomenon?
I think there's a big relation. As someone myself who is kind of if you had to put me in a kind of a school of hypothesis, I would probably more in the psychosocial school, which is very interested in these kind of cultural influences, both in science fiction, things like in early pulp fiction and science fiction, and really ufology in general kind of there's a straight continuous line of development from the theosophical and spiritualist movements that developed in the end of the 1800s. Those kind of developed into some of the kind of more occult and kind of like new age kind of groups in the Americas and elsewhere. And before the flying saucer era, you even had people like the Borderlands Research Society, people like Meade Lane, Mark Probert, etc., that were essentially contactees, but they were channeling extraterrestrials. And then they kind of became, and instead of saucers, they were called ether ships. And this is all pre-1947, right? And so all this stuff is a kind of a continuous development that started, with a lot of stuff that was developing around the turn of the century.
Shout out to Matt Riot. We spoke about Meade Lane a couple weeks ago. So if you didn't hear that, that's posted here on my Twitter feed and also on my YouTube channel. Go check it out. It was a great conversation. So I'm sorry, I think I cut somebody off.
Oh, I was just going to ask Jeff. One thing that would be really fascinating to know a whole lot more about is Bigelow's interests and contacts in this, because he's sort of always in the background there. And I wonder how long he knew Art Bell when he did his political radio show before he sponsored, because, he gave Art Bell the seed money to start up his show in the early 90s. But since Bigelow is such a player in this paranormal field, and has gotten involved even with military money and stuff, as we all know later on, and the Mount Wilson picture that Chris has posted, that's going to be on Shane's program next week. I can't remember.
I think we lost VC there. Does anybody else still hear him?
But we're
Oh,
all temporarily
I'm
unmuted
sorry.
there for a second, Lou.
That's my fault. I think I accidentally pressed something by accident on my phone and it muted everyone.
Oh,
Bad.
okay.
Oh, okay.
My
yeah,
bad.
Yeah. No,
Where
you're
was I?
good. Yeah, you're my co-host, so yeah, you got the power to mute people if you want. Sorry, VC, we cut you off there. Can
Fat
you,
thumb.
yeah, no, it's all good. Can you go back and say
Okay.
again what you were saying?
Yeah, just what was the last thing I was saying, just so I don't repeat the whole thing.
Oh, well, about Bigelow, you were interested when you got into the topic. Is that what you wanted to know?
Okay.
Well, the thing I found interesting is that Bigelow was the seed money for Art Bell to start
Yeah.
Coast to Coast. That's wild. That's the first time I've heard that.
Yeah,
Well,
I didn't know that
yeah,
either.
yes, he gave him the seed money to start that show from the very beginning. But see, they all lived out there in that area together, and
Yeah.
I bet that Art Bell knew Bigelow even before, because Art Bell did a political show for many years, maybe 10 years or more, out there. But all I'm trying to say is that this is the nucleus of the whole. A lot of this entertainment field and everything starts with him in the modern era. And also you get into the military picture and the invisible college thing with put off, with that picture of Chris Bartell or whatever he has, that picture of Mount Wilson with Jock Valet and put off, and a whole bunch of the other big names, and John Alexander getting all involved in this. I think what people have found out about Bigelow and these players could shed a lot of light on what things have been happening, with all the entertainment things that have come out of it, and with some of the military stuff that they were doing. What in the hell were they trying to develop there? Some kind of psyops weapons for those 2 years, doing some kind of psychological experiments, maybe using some type of equipment to affect people's minds on some way. I mean, the experiments seem to have been doing that, whether that was at Skinwalker or at Bigelow's aerospace location. These security people were brought to both locations for experiments. But anyway, I just wanted to know if you've researched Bigelow in any big way, and these players that he's associated with, because I think there's this inner group, that's hidden that would shed a lot of light.
Yeah, the usual suspects, as I like to call them, or the SRI put off Bigelow network. Yeah, so basically, Bigelow goes back at least to, really, ultimately, all roads lead to Bob Lazar, and then roads from Bob Lazar lead to John Lear and put off from the SRI guys. But Bigelow has been in the topic at least since the early '90s. He actually started a business with Bob Lazar called ZI Reticuli 2 back in, I think, 1990. Bigelow put a bunch of money into abduction research in about 92, 93, I believe. He sponsored the work of like Bud Hopkins and John Mack and a couple of these other guys. There was a Roper study on the Alexander religious study about UFOs, where they asked people. That's another thing that Bigelow funded and published in the '90s. So Bigelow was heavily involved in this topic. My understanding is that he got into it actually because of Bob Lazar, through George Knapp, and I could be wrong about that, but I believe that's he may have had a lifelong interest, but I believe that's when he got hooked up with these people, was through Bob Lazar. And then, of course,
didn't he also hang out with Lear as well, John Lear?
Yeah, and he hung out with I guess Linda Moulton Howe. Linda Moulton Howe, apparently Bigelow thought, she was going to be his beau or something, but apparently Linda Moulton Howe was like, nah, he's like a creepy old guy or something. But apparently, yeah. So he was hanging out with all these guys back then and putting a lot of money into the topic, but and he's been around a long time, and really, so it all goes down to Lazar, which then of course goes to Lear, and the kind of start of conspiracy culture and what's called dark side ufology of the 80s, where you've got the Bill Moore and the Lear and the people introducing these class retrieval narratives, and Men in Black and government conspiracies, and that really kind of changed ufology forever. We're still on the dark side of what's called dark side ufology. But then the same people have these connections that go back even further with the put off and the SRI guys, and the valet, was all involved with those guys. So it's really it's really a small circle of people that have been involved with this going back decades, and they've been behind all the major pushes, from getting involved with Skinwalker Ranch, OSAP, to all the recent stuff. It's all the same players and characters.
Jeff,
I
can you
found
also
one of the most hilarious things is that Bob Lazar, Bigelow gave him a whole bunch of money to open up a facility where he could do the science on element 115. And Bob, all he did was just shove all of his shit, his personal like couches and shit, in between a move, and he kept it there for so long that Bigelow was like, you know what, I'm shutting this down. You got to get your furniture out of the lab that I paid for.
And like scammed him with like soap or something, like that was supposed to be aerogel or some crazy thing. Like it was
Dude,
like,
if it is Lazar that got him to start spending crazy money and seeking government contracts to pay for spooky investigations, it's
yeah.
wild to think that Bob would turn around and screw him like that, but he would continue to be like, "Oh, this is real," and continue with this so gallantly. He was so open about it. That 60 Minutes interview was wild.
It wouldn't be the only rich believer that's thrown a lot of money in a lot of bogus science projects. I mean, it's, being rich does not exclude you from having beliefs and interest. It just gives you the money to throw at them. And
well,
as far as Bigelow goes,
between
that's the first time that I'm aware of was Bob
yeah.
Lazar.
Yeah,
So.
between Lazar and Bigelow, what's interesting though, I've seen some short video clips where Bigelow is talking about that, and even maybe with them both together, but they seem to be like party animal tricksters. I mean, Bigelow was laughing about how they go out there near Area 51 and recounting stories about how Lazar is going to get the people activated at Area 51 to show up with some kind of balloon thing they're going to blow up and have it come over so they can just, screw with them. I mean, mess with them, So he seems to me like he's a big kind of happy-go-lucky player guy to sort of be a trickster type personality. But he's the power. I mean, he knows how to play. He plays the politicians with millions of dollars, not Lazar. Lazar, I think, is just a trinket to him.
Well, I think that's the reason
Yeah.
why he gets to do that, is because he also donates to those campaigns. He donated to Harry Reid. He's donated to Trump. He's donated to politicians in his state where just like Fugel has been doing through his TV show. It's the same thing.
One of the other interesting aspects of that story as well is that George Knapp knew Bob Lazar prior to that interview. The meetings that they had were when he went to do a report for Class TV at Bob Lazar's firework machine gun explosive festival thing. So
Desert
I think
Blast.
their relationship went back even further. And Jeff, just talking to that, what's the significance of Las Vegas to this story? Because I think it's central.
Before I mention that, I will say Bob Lazar still does that, you guys. Bob Lazar lives in Oregon now. He doesn't use balloons. He uses drones, and he attaches sparklers to them, and he flies them around to create UFO sightings. He's talked about it recently. So Bob Lazar is still faking UFO sightings with fireworks.
Wow.
But as far
But
as
to the Las Vegas point,
yeah, the Vegas point. I mean, so Vegas, uh, it's it's got that national test site that has always been a very restricted test site, and that's where we've tested things like the U2s, and it's always been, you know, people have always had questions of what goes on there. I think any place where you have a big, you know, very, very secret facility, and by all accounts, Area 51 was the most secretive kind of facility in the world and most restricted facility in the world, and it leaves people to ask questions. So not only do we have these test flights, that things that are being done up there that can be confused for like UFOs, you know, we got a lot of, you know, conspiracy mythology that developed in the 80s.
but the central characters of this story, a lot of them
They're
are
all from there.
situated and
Yeah.
located in Las Vegas, and I find that
Yeah.
fascinating. In that, you know, in the kind of con man, you know, central of America, that's the sort of heart of ufology in my mind.
And
And
I wonder how much Bigelow might idolize or think about Howard Hughes' history there, because that's even crazier in many ways. And if you all don't know about Howard Hughes, but there he was a he was one of the richest men in the world, but he comes straight out of that military industrial complex and entertainment complex. He produced movies in Hollywood and things like that, but he had, you know, one of the largest world airlines and a military construction aircraft called Hughes Aircraft. He even got involved in one of the largest ships to go around the world to dig up get things from at the bottom of the deep ocean. And in this case, one of it was to get one of the only nuclear Russian submarines that sunk under covert conditions. And somebody was claiming the other day, I heard, he was also using that ship to get other things. But you see, he's out of Las Vegas, and he kind of went insane at the end of his life and became a hermit and really odd behavior. At least that's the way it was reported. But and just all kinds of wild stuff written about his life, controversy with his will, and just everything. So I just wonder if Bigelow has identified in some ways, because he got into the aerospace thing and he's gotten into all this crazy stuff. And apparently Howard used to fly in, because he was a pilot with his aircraft company. He used to fly into Adamski's gatherings out in California, I had heard. I don't know how many times, but you know, so you have this phenomena preceding even Bigelow with the Howard Hughes guy.
Well, it's
I
also
will.
really funny that George, if you guys have ever heard George Knapp's story of how he ended up in Vegas, it was literally a coin flip from his description of it. But it is funny that Vegas holds one of the most top secret military bases on the planet, and it also happens to house the world's most famous UFO hucksters on the planet. It is quite interesting.
I just wanted to point out kind of a weird 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon kind of UFO connection to Howard Hughes. So Howard Hughes is his biographies was written by a journalist named Jim Phelan. Jim Phelan was Edward Ruppelt's neighbor and actually wrote Ruppelt's book, the Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. So when Ruppelt was offered by True to write the story and then later expand that into like a book-length version, you know, Ruppelt wasn't a writer, but his neighbor Jim Phelan was a pretty well-known journalist who actually, you know, followed Howard Hughes around for years and wrote the biography on him, wrote that book for him and with him. So that's just a weird kind of connection. So
Well, real quick, I had a question. Craftbeard had to step down, but he messaged me a question to ask Mr. Knox. He asked, Jeff, what, if anything, did we learn from the Soviet Union's records after the fall of the USSR? And this is also kind of a segue from George Knapp or that era into sort of a little bit of George Knapp's work. And is there time? Does he know any earlier abduction accounts before Betty and Barney Hill? And if there's time, do you know of any other earlier accounts before Betty and Barney?
yeah. So the first part of that Oh, wow, my brain just got blank. What was that first part again?
Yeah, the first part was the USSR, the Soviet
Oh,
Union's
okay.
records after the fall of the USSR. Any interesting UFO things that pop out from those records that came out?
Yeah, so the thing with like the USSR records, and I'm not a total expert on that. I have covered quite a few USSR cases, and there is a book by Jack Valet called Samsadat something that covers some of these cases. And you mentioned Knapp. Knapp supposedly, got some of these records and brought them back. But the problem with some of the stuff that Knapp hasn't really shared those files with anyone. Like, he will post a couple of them. Like, he'll share them like with the Daily Mail. He'll post like 1 or 2 pages or something. But he won't actually share those with most researchers that have requested them. So we really don't even know what's in those files. The other problem is it's hard to know what's accurate with some of the stories that come out of the USSR, because there was a lot of propaganda going on. There was a lot of these major UFO stories that we know about that were published in newspapers like Pravda and other outlets that were essentially little more than propaganda outlets. And it's likely some of these cases never even took place. In fact, some of the more famous or sensational kind of like stories of like a test pilot dying in an encounter with a UFO, there's no evidence that guy even existed. And so the USSR stuff's a bit difficult, but I'm not an expert on it. It's interesting that they ask about that, because I'll probably learn a little bit more, because I've been asked to review an article on the history of ufology in the USSR by a non-native speaker. He wants an English speaker to kind of go over it. So hopefully I'll learn some more about that. But yeah, the stuff we have out of the USSR is somewhat limited. We do have some cases. There's another book by Philip Mantle, in fact, and Paul Stonehill on USO, underwater submergible object cases out of Russia. They also published another book on UFO cases out of Russia with some of the cases that have been shared. But most of what we have has been just basically stuff that's been leaked out by a few researchers, or like a famous Russian researcher named Felix Ziegel is probably the most famous Russian ufologist. So the information out of there is limited, and you've got to be careful and see what you can verify. And I encountered just in a case recently, I posted of a Russian case about a test pilot that had 2 or 3 separate encounters. I can't find any evidence this guy exists. Like, I've looked up his name both in Cyrillic spelling and in Anglicized spelling, and there's nothing on the internet about this test pilot, just period, except for the mentions of some UFO stories and UFO books. So it's kind of really hard to verify some of that information, because ufology was kind of heavily restricted back in the day, back during the USSR period. There wasn't a lot of open ufology being done.
And yeah, does anybody, I see hands up, so if you guys want to chime in there, and then if we got time, we'll ask Andres' second question. But did you guys have anything to chime in there on the USSR stuff, or anything else that we mentioned? Okay, maybe I don't. I feel like my room is glitching out. Like, I see hands up, I see listeners that are actually speakers, so it's a little weird. I don't know what the hell is going on with these Twitter Spaces, but I feel like everyone I listen to and everyone I host are kind of glitchy. But for the most part, this has been going pretty smooth. Okay, so the second question, the follow up was, do you know of any abduction cases before Betty and Barney Hill?
Oh yeah.
We spoke about this with B Lane a little bit, but yeah, I'm curious to know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so the Betty and Barney Hill is really kind of, it's the one that made them abductions famous, at least in the U.S. But there was cases like the Antonio Villalobos case in Brazil. That was, I want to say, 1957. There's even what's been called potentially the first alleged alien abduction that took place in 1896 in Lodi, California. And it's a weird looking kind of creature that looks like he's holding up a balloon, a lighted balloon or something in his hand, that supposedly tried to, take this guy away. And of course, the alien abduction kind of like motif goes back way back. Like you see it in fairy lore, you see it in shamanistic visions. You see it going in literature. In the 1800s, even in science fiction literature in the 1800s. So the antecedents were really there. And there certainly were cases in the 50s. I think they started to really take off, I think, more in South America than in the US. But the Hills is certainly the one that kind of put it on the map. But the Via Boas case, and again, it depends on some cases what you consider an abduction or not. Is it an abduction if they just bring you on the craft, but you don't like go anywhere? Is it only an abduction if they take you? Is it an abduction if you go willingly on the craft? So what you would call occupant encounters, or like close encounters of like the third kind, those go back to the 50s. So
What reminded me to ask a question was, did you ever look into Cynthia Hind with the aerial school in Zimbabwe? Because I think it was either her or the teacher of the class, but she was this big UFO investigator, and I think it's probably her that created the
It was definitely her.
that created the contamination. But I did some research. I mean, by that, I mean, I'm participating on a forum in a big way 10 years or so ago, and came across postings where there was newspaper records or some documentation about her being in the UK before she moved to Zimbabwe. And she was already a UFO researcher, and actually got involved in some sort of a school incident in the UK involving children in UFOs. And so it was sort of a scandalous thing that happened there. I don't know if you ever heard anything about that, but, and then, yeah, as far as the abduction thing, people were, in the 50s, they were making up all kinds of stories. They're talking about going to different planets and traveling with them. Now, as far as it being a hostile abduction, I don't know how many of those were, but it was sure fun to talk about, going to different planets and things by people all the time. So, but anyway, I was curious if you knew anything about that Cynthia Hind issue.
yeah, first I'd say abductions to me are basically a sub form of contactees. It's just where the contact isn't voluntary. And that's kind of all I've always looked at that. As far as Cynthia Hind, yeah, for people that don't know, Cynthia Hind was probably one of the main researchers, UFO researchers in Africa. She published a publication called Afro News. And she also put out like a book, UFOs of Africa. And she was one of the main researchers in the aerial school incident. And honestly, one of our listeners, Gideon Reed, is the expert here. But yeah, she was one of the main investigators on this case. And in this case, I think we have a situation that we see in ufology a lot. In the days preceding the event, there was kind of a rocket reentry or meteorite or whatever event that happened that if you actually look at a lot of the sketches, and the thing is, Cynthia Hind actually published these in her journal, these sketches of this kind of reentry event that looks like these kind of craft, like you see in a lot of meteor sightings that people report as UFOs, these kind of like cigar, like kind of like shaped craft and whatnot. And she actually covered that story as well, and she covered the aerial school case. And I think there's certainly a lot of a ufologist comes on scene and takes a pretty mundane situation and develops it into something far more fantastical that didn't actually happen. But again, I highly recommend going and looking at the work of Gideon Reed on the aerial case. He has covered this in a lot of depth. He's pulled up newspaper articles from around the time in the area, like what they had watching on television that was UFO or alien related in the weeks before the event happened. He talks about the meteor or the rocket reentry or whatever event. He's done a lot of really great work on that case. But yeah, Cynthia Hind, she was a fairly big researcher, but like many researchers, they've kind of got a mystery to perpetuate. So
Yeah, but nothing about her originating from the UK prior to that.
I'm not familiar with that. I'm not really familiar with her biography or history beyond that. But all I know is that during the time she was doing a lot of that UFO research, she lived down there in South Africa. So.
Oh, sorry. I just realized my mic was on. I was chewing ice. Apologies. Well, Jeff, this has been an amazing conversation. And I got to say, when I asked you about the researchers that you feel like should be mentioned more, I think your name should also be included in that. Because this has been a fun dive in sort of some of the history, a bright brush of history of ufology, and I've enjoyed every second of this conversation, and I hope in the future, anytime we have spaces like this, I encourage and hope that you come up more, because I think your perspective and your demeanor when it comes to explaining this topic is so needed. It's just
An
absolutely so
actual
needed.
expert, Lou, for
An
once.
actual expert. Yeah.
And I may not, know everything, but I'm pretty good at knowing where to look for things, at least if I don't know it. So I tend to be pretty good at throwing the references out. So if people want to know where they can learn about something, like I've usually got a book that I can throw out or a paper I can tell you about to go read. So yeah, I'll try and do some more of these spaces, or at least show up and provide some insight. They just, they take so much time because they're so much fun, and then I can't get any actual research done.
Yeah. What can I ask? For the people that are diving into this discussion sort of head first and are kind of new into this this very shallow pool, what are your best tips going into this discussion?
So one of the pieces of advice that I would give, and I was thinking about it when Craftbeard was talking earlier, is that there's a lot of different ways like you can approach this topic. And one of the mistakes that I feel like I made when I was younger is that I had such a narrow view of how to look at things. Like for me, it was all about proving whether or not something was a spaceship or not, you know? And so I wasn't really interested in a lot of the other aspects and ways of looking at the topic. Like I dismissed I didn't even study the contactee phenomenon and a lot of that stuff back then, because I was a nuts and bolts guy, and that's garbage. That's bunk. There's nothing worth studying in any of that stuff. There's nothing you can get out of that. I was more of a science guy, but there's so many ways to look at this topic, philosophically, looking at the sociology, looking at the religious aspects of the topic. And so many people, when you mention some of this stuff, they act like you're just a debunker. Like, why are you talking about the religious aspects? Like, what's that got to do with whether aliens are here or not? Like you can talk and look at this topic from these different perspectives, and that says nothing about whether or not the topic is real or not, or whether or not any individual case, is non-human or not. Like, just because you're interested in these other aspects doesn't mean the topic's bunk. Just because you study, for example, like eyewitness testimony, doesn't mean you think all UFO cases are bunk and all eyewitnesses are liars. Like, you can study this stuff without dismissing the topic outright. And I encourage people to try and expand their perspectives and not take just this one narrow, like, kind of road through this topic, because I feel like I kind of wasted many years kind of excluding different things that I just wouldn't even look at because I thought it was silly and there was no point to it. I'm interested in the aliens. And I think that's a bad way to go. And I would hope some people could maybe save some time by widening their perspective, and also just learn that we don't need to agree with everything. A lot of the people I work with and do research with, and I respect, I actually don't agree with them on very much at all about this topic. Like, I have widely different perspectives from most people, but I can work with them because, I don't need to agree with people. People need to learn, I think, to not take things so personally. and to kind of just relax, and that this topic can be fun, and people don't need to believe the same thing as you, but we can still all get along and work together on this topic.
Yeah, from your lips to God's ears, I know I'm guilty of doing exactly that, because I can get frustrated as hell with the topic. I've experienced every spectrum of emotion and belief in this discussion, and yeah, it's just like it's been strong at times, and then it's absolutely waned to almost nothing. And yeah, it is frustrating from a former believer and experiencer to kind of now turn around and have to rationalize um, a lot of the same uh, debate points that I used to say myself. And it's like, okay, you're not really listening, you're not hearing the question correctly, or you're not deciphering the answer properly. Like I used to do that with Mick West. Anytime I had a discussion with Mick West, I would hear only the parts that would trigger my sort of frustration with, why is he not getting this? And really it was, why am I not understanding what he's saying? And so yeah, it's tough. It's tough, man. It's a tough thing. But
And I get that the thing is, with any strong belief, people feel attacked when you question it. Like they feel like you're personally attacking them,
right.
when really when you're not. And the thing is, like, you also don't need to kind of die on the hill of like single cases. So many people kind of obsess over a single case, and they think because you don't believe that case, or because you believe you found an explanation for that case, or so-called debunked it, that you must think there's nothing to this topic. And that's just not true. See, each case needs to be handled on its own individual merits. And just because somebody doesn't believe one case doesn't mean they think there's nothing to the topic. Like, I wouldn't be in this if I didn't think there was value and use in studying this stuff. But I get called a debunker and attacked. We need to learn to be more tolerant of people, that just because we don't believe everything you do or every case you do doesn't mean we think there's nothing to this topic.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I hope in the coming weeks and months that we hear your voice more, because like I said, I think it's a valuable voice to have in the discussions, and I appreciate you letting me be the first to host you as a speaker. That's a lot of fun. I didn't realize this was the very first space you'd ever spoken in. So,
Yeah,
thanks for being here.
I just want to thank you too for showing up, because it definitely enlivened the whole conversation and gave a lot of variety to it and history. And the other thing I would just say, since this is recorded space, to save time, if somebody's new to the field, I would still encourage people to look in to Carl Jung and his book on the UFOs. That's you can find on YouTube to listen to. And also one interview that I think is key to understanding this whole phenomena and everything. And this is from an expert who knows this field and knows Carl Jung very well. And her name is Laura London, but she goes by Jungian Laura on YouTube. Now, on her own channel, she has a whole series called the Quarantine Series, and separate from Jung. And those are good. But the thing that I'm recommending most is to go to Walter Bosley's channel. He's an ex-Air Force intelligence person that protected UFO top secret programs and stuff. But he did the only interview she's ever given about her personal feelings. And I'll tell you why she's so undercover and won't even talk about it on her own channel. It's because people are so aggressive in this field. If you have a different opinion or viewpoint, you really can be viciously attacked. And I've had that personally happen to me over the Roswell slides thing, something I haven't talked about, but can be very dangerous and even criminal. And I think something's happened to her that she just doesn't want to get into it anymore. But I'm just saying, she was in the paranormal field, knew all the personalities and the luminaries since the late 80s and 90s. She's had the interest in following this for decades, and she's a Jungian Carl Jung expert, and she herself has been analyzed under that for, I think, like 17 years. So if you want to look at this phenomena from another perspective that I think is the accurate one, and I've been interested in this for my whole life, I think that's a key interview and a key thing to look into. That's all.
Yeah, I'll if you can, VC Smart, if you can give me a follow or post or tag me in the video that you're referencing, so then I can share it and maybe next time in another discussion we can all talk about it. Because I'm interested to know, because this kind of sounds a little bit has some parallels to my journey, in that, you know, I had a big show. I talked to all the luminaries. I was good and buddy with all these guys, and then it changed. You know, it all changed. So I'm interested to hear that aspect of you know, of her story.
I will say I'm friends and colleagues with a guy named Richard Knoll, who actually wrote the book The Young Cult, and a couple of other critical volumes on Carl Jung. He's a bit of an expert on Carl Jung, but he's also in the UFO topic, and he wrote one of the papers in the recent book, The Reliability of UFO Witness Testimony, on comparing the satanic panic abuse situation with abduction scenario. And he's written on that going back to the 1980s. And if people want to search my feed for Jung, they'll actually find quite a bit of material, stuff he's found about UFOs, a paper that was published in recent years about his correspondence between Donald Kehoe. And there's an excellent chapter on Jung and UFOs by a guy named Siegel in the book UFOs and Religions, that I highly recommend people check out. But if you just search my Twitter for Jung, you'll probably find all of this material and more.
Right on. I love it. Does anybody have any other comments or thoughts before I end this space and get out of here tonight? Love it. Okay, well, guys, I cannot appreciate everyone enough for the folks who joined us for this conversation. Again, if you guys aren't following me, do me a favor, smack that follow button. Go check out the YouTube channel. Give us a follow there. I want to say again, thank you to Jeff Knox for letting me be the first venue to have this conversation. I can't wait to post this to YouTube. I think it's going to be a big hit. I think it'll get a lot of love. Yeah, man. I hope to hear from you more in these venues, and we got to get a space where it's you, Matt Riot, Craft Beard, I'm Not Here, and really just get into the nitty gritty of some things some more. So I really love it. I think these conversations are so fun. And I mean, we didn't even get into the, you know, I would have loved to pick your brain. I don't know if you saw that Rolls-Royce nuclear engine that's come out recently, but yeah, there's just a lot of stuff, you know. And again, like going back to the satellite systems and the telescopes that we have, you know, in space now. And I think some of the big announcements that we might be getting here in the next decade or two are super exciting and should garner our attention and our research and our devotion just as much as the, you know, the unknown. Like, I think the known is just as interesting as the unknown. And if there's one thing, I think one of the most interesting things about the UFO discussion that a lot of people miss is the fact that if it's not alien, the things that people see with these observables, then that means it's probably hand and human made, which is still really cool. Like, that means that maybe humans have really cracked something amazing, and we're just on the verge of seeing aspects of it. So I'm excited about that just as much as I am aliens visiting the planet.
One thing I would add, Lou, is that I would love to hear a conversation in which Jeff and Emily Louise from Weird Reads with Emily discuss the kind of early kind of days of ufology and those kind of slightly darker kind of seedlings that turned into ufology, and their origins, and what those kind of things looked like back then, and who those people were, because I think that's a very fascinating part of the story, and I think it's reflected very much in the way that it's being morphed and changed today. I think it's very, very relevant.
I think
That
that's
would be
an incredible idea. Yeah. What were
That
you
would be
gonna say?
a lot of fun. A lot of
Yeah.
fun. And as far as researchers, like newer researchers, Emily absolutely is one of the fantastic, bunch of newer, younger generation of researchers that does really great research and puts out very great video documentaries and does very good interviews as well with people. I highly recommend her work, and I would love to talk to her about that stuff. So
Yeah, well, I will set it up. I will reach out to her, and I think that's a great suggestion. I would love, yeah, that I will set up for, I think, an earlier time, so that way she can join, and we can. Pip, you're in the UK, yes?
Yes, I am. I'm
What time?
also in touch. I'm also in touch with Emily. Yeah.
What time is it there?
Right now, it's coming up to 1:45 a.m.
Okay, yeah. So we could probably do this at like noon, and then I know she's a night owl, so she's probably up anyway. But
Yeah, she's always up late, like me.
yeah. So I guess it doesn't really matter. So yes, if you'd like, you can reach out to her. I would love to set that up for maybe in the next week or two. I mean, we just had a conversation with Jess, so I don't want to commit him to a back-to-back week. But yeah, and whenever she's available, I'd love to do that. Any Wednesday or Thursday at her convenience.
yeah, just let me know when. I'm
Sounds
flexible.
Yeah, that sounds fun. Yeah, I'll also just pop her a little DM and see if she's interested. All right. Well, with that said, you guys, again, I appreciate everyone's participation in the space. And yeah, until next time, we'll see you all soon. Have a great night and rest of your week, and enjoy the weekend. We'll see you tomorrow for Lou Review at 3
Thanks,
p.m.
Jeff.
Pacific.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Peace.